Welcome to the debate. Today, we are taking a deep dive into Robert Walker's book, The Heretic and a Crown. The text brings us to a really specific historical precipice, which is the year 1570. You have an aging Pope Pius V and an unmarried Queen Elizabeth I. And together, they basically set in motion a profound collision between medieval Christendom and the violent emergence of the modern nation-state.
Yeah, and Walker's analysis really forces us to look closely at the human cost of that collision. And I think it brings us to the central question we are debating today. Did Queen Elizabeth I's pragmatic via media, her famous middle way, did that represent a masterful and necessary triumph of statecraft and survival, or did her deliberate ambiguity and the resulting intelligence apparatus constitute a ruthless system of state terror that trapped innocent citizens in an unwinnable moral dilemma?
Right. And my position is that Elizabeth's pragmatic prioritization of state stability over doctrinal purity was a necessary and frankly brilliant mechanism for England's survival.
And my position is that Elizabeth's approach was a cruel engine of persecution. It weaponized ambiguity, forcing ordinary citizens to constantly choose between their immortal souls and their mortal lives.
Well, let me begin by establishing the fundamental strategy that Walker outlines here. Elizabeth's primary achievement was her ability to redefine a religious crisis as a matter of national sovereignty. If you look at how she reacted to Regnans and Excelsis, that was the papal bull where Pope Pius V essentially drew a line in the sand. He weaponized theology by declaring Elizabeth illegitimate, a heretic, and he explicitly released all her Catholic subjects from their legal and moral oaths to obey her. He tried to unmake a Tudor monarch with paper and red wax. Yet Elizabeth deliberately chose to punish treason, not faith. She established a framework where she refused to, as she put it, make windows into men's souls. Walker really highlights her calculated public elevation of Lord Howard.
Right, the Naval Commission.
Exactly. Howard was a known, loyal Catholic, yet Elizabeth deliberately brought him forward in the Great Hall, appointing him to her special commission on naval readiness. This was living proof that she allowed private conscience to exist so long as public loyalty to the crown remained absolute. By separating the spiritual from the civic, I argue she forged the modern state.
But the text reveals that this supposed separation of private faith and public loyalty was a deadly illusion. By making the Pope's spiritual decree a matter of national security, she provided the exact justification needed for the creation of Francis Walsingham's ruthless surveillance state. The book forces us to look at the ordinary pawns, not just the grand masters in this game.
Right.
Take the Thorntons of Middleham, for example. They had to hide their rosaries beneath floorboards. They celebrated Mass in secret cellars. Or look at the silk merchant Richard Holbrook, who lived in perpetual, quiet terror. Elizabeth told Holbrook his faith remained between him and God, giving him what she herself called permission to pretend. But, this wasn't mercy. It was a psychological and physical cage. It was a pervasive system of surveillance where literally any private devotion could eventually be framed as public treason.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on the sheer existential scale of the threat she faced and the calculus of leadership required to meet it. Elizabeth was surrounded by European powers eager to dismantle her realm. Walker takes us inside the consistory chamber with Pope Pius V dictating the bull, and he's operating on this terrifying theological mathematics where souls count more than bodies.
Yeah, that's a chilling phrase.
It really is. Pius was entirely willing to incite bloodshed, believing physical death was temporary, while spiritual death was eternal. He explicitly stated that it was better to spill the blood of heretics than risk the damnation of souls. So, faced with an adversary willing to burn the world down to save its soul, Elizabeth used calculated theater and intelligence rather than immediate military force to outmaneuver sedition.
Calculated theater is a very sanitized way to describe what was actually happening, though.
Well, it was theater designed to prevent civil war. Look at how she handled Lord Pembroke's subtle challenge in Westminster Hall. She invoked her mother Anne Boleyn's name simply to remind the court of the ultimate cost of treason. Or consider how she quietly used Walsingham's network to track Thomas Percy's brewing rebellion in the north. She baited him to reveal his hand before he could strike. She used precise statecraft to prevent the kind of total, bloody religious wars that were at that very moment tearing the rest of Europe apart.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. Elizabeth's calculated theater was backed by profound brutality, and Walker does not let us look away from that reality. Yes, Pius V operated in the open with his decrees and his theological mathematics, but Elizabeth utilized the dark cellars of Whitehall to achieve her ends. Consider the fate of the wine merchant Giacomo Bartoli. He got caught up in the Ridolfi plot, which was a conspiracy to put Mary, Queen of Scots, on the throne.
Right, a very real plot.
A real plot, yes, but Walsingham's men crushed Bartoli's thumbs in devices explicitly designed by the Spanish Inquisition. He was deprived of sleep and water, tortured until he surrendered a cipher key based on Dante's Inferno. We need to pause and recognize the historical shift here. Crushing a man's thumbs for a cryptographic key rather than a theological confession is the exact moment medieval religious persecution mutated into modern geopolitical espionage. When a state resorts to utilizing the exact same instruments of terror as its enemies just to protect a Protestant queen, it completely loses the moral high ground. It is state terror masquerading as political pragmatism. Walsingham's ledger of names wasn't statecraft, it was a hit list.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. Defending the middle way means recognizing the historical alternatives actually available to her. Walker points out that Elizabeth avoided the wholesale slaughter seen in France, or even under her sister Mary's reign. After the Northern Rebellion at Durham Moor, while the architect Percy and his immediate lieutenant Neville were executed, she showed remarkable leniency toward the common folk.
Leniency? She still subjected the populace to martial law.
Yes, but she pardoned the vast majority of the farmers and minor nobles who followed Percy and Dacre, commanding them to return peacefully to their homes and occupations. She carefully balanced justice and mercy. And look again at her message to Richard Holbrook in the courtyard. She explicitly told him that as an importer of silks, she didn't care about his church attendance as long as he was a loyal subject. She even noted that his Italian suppliers didn't check his religion before selling him goods. This pragmatism in an era of holy wars was deeply merciful. She offered a path to survival that simply did not exist anywhere else in Europe. She refused to create martyrs if she could avoid it.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the profound moral corruption this mercy required? Walker's interludes are devastating, precisely because they translate these massive geopolitical maneuvers into impossible human dilemmas. Look at Margaret Thornton. She is standing out over the Yorkshire moors, realizing that sending a simple letter of loyalty to Lord Burghley to save her family's lands meant, in her mind, risking eternal damnation. Imagine believing with your entire soul that if you deny your faith, you will burn in hell for eternity. Now imagine the government telling you that practicing your faith is treason, punishable by a traitor's death. That's the impossible trap Walker is documenting here. Margaret's husband Robert drafted that letter knowing it could cost them their souls. They were forced to mouth Protestant prayers to a God they hoped was still listening while passing their true faith to their children in whispers and shadows.
But those children lived. They weren't orphaned by the executioner's block.
Yes, they survived physically, but look at the psychological cost of the system as a whole. Thomas Pinner, Walsingham's agent, murdered Edward Stafford in a Southwark alley simply because Stafford believed in the Catholic cause and sought Spanish aid. Elizabeth herself confessed to our cousin Catherine that giving her subjects permission to pretend meant managing the pretense while the substance slid away beneath their feet. A system that requires citizens to live a fundamental lie corrupts the nation's soul. It's a quiet terror, but it is terror nonetheless.
I think we have to recognize that the pretense was the very mechanism of peace. By demanding outward conformity rather than inward purity, she actively stopped the cycle of burnings at the stake. Elizabeth understood that forcing people to be martyrs serves no one but theologians. Walker shows us Elizabeth staring out at the darkness, acknowledging that Pope Pius had forced a choice she could not unmake. She knew that pushing too hard would create the exact rebellion they were trying to prevent, but not pushing hard enough would invite a Spanish invasion. And the surveillance state you decry was actually highly targeted.
Was it, though?
Yes, Walsingham's cryptographers weren't just spying for the sake of spying.
They were sitting in windowless rooms deciphering Florentine banking codes because they were looking for actual funded plots, like the Ridolfi plan to land 6,000 Spanish troops on English soil and assassinate the Queen. That is not an illusion of security. That is the literal defense of the realm against active, foreign-backed conspiracies.
It may have defended the realm, but we cannot ignore what it did to the people caught in its gears. Tell that to Robert Cadre, the would-be assassin at Tilbury, who went to his death singing Latin hymns, completely broken by a system that confiscated his family's estates and forced his faith underground. Or Marco Benedetti, the young papal courier riding north through the cold with the bull strapped to his chest, knowing his life expectancy was measured in weeks because he carried ink on parchment.
Right.
The middle way didn't eliminate martyrs. It just redefined them as traitors. The text makes it clear that Elizabeth still executed Catholics. She merely did it more quietly, calling treason what Rome called martyrdom. Walsingham himself recognizes this when he looks at his ledger of dead agents and intercepted plotters. The state demanded that ordinary people abandon their deeply held spiritual truths to serve the civic order.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because the ultimate vindication of Elizabeth's strategy is the survival and flourishing of England itself. We see her triumphant presence at Tilbury during the Spanish Armada. When the weather turned, the Spanish fleet was scattered, and she was elevated from monarch to a living myth. She preserved the nation's independence against the greatest superpower of the age. Furthermore, she managed a meticulous, peaceful transition of power to James Stuart, actively working with Robert Cecil to secure the succession without a drop of blood shed in civil war.
True.
Walker's thesis is profoundly clear here. She fostered a cultural golden age, an era that eventually produced Shakespeare, precisely because she refused to let religious extremes dictate state policy. She authorized funds for Francis Drake's expeditions, while simultaneously granting privileges to theatrical companies. As Walker notes, she built the foundation of the modern nation-state by putting the survival of the realm above the dogma of the church. The survival of the state has to be the ultimate moral good, when the alternative is the slaughter of the Wars of the Roses.
I come at it from a different way. Walker's book actively disputes the uncritical glorification of this legacy. If we look at what Walker actually documents, we have to grapple with the haunting conclusion of the text. Look at Archbishop Whitgift's deathbed realization. He sat with the dying queen and realized that their grand compromise ultimately required persecuting both extremes, punishing Catholics and Puritans alike for simply believing too much. Whitgift himself admits to signing orders sending faithful Christians to the rack because their faith was inconvenient to the crown. And we absolutely cannot ignore Christopher Marlowe's ghostly letter about the truth so carefully hidden.
Marlowe was part of that very same intelligence apparatus, though.
Exactly, which is why his perspective is so damning. Marlowe points out that the greatest art of the era was born of survival and evasion. He notes that the Golden Age casts shadows, and some people are buried in them. Walker's entire book asks us to count the dead, to remember the priests hanged, drawn, and quartered at Tyburn, to look at the executed nobles, or the printer John Pendry, who was dragged from his screaming family for writing pamphlets, and the ordinary people caught in the machinery of Walsingham's state. The Golden Age you describe was built on a foundation of necessary but undeniable state cruelty. The survival of the state came at the severe cost of its conscience.
But history requires those hard choices. In Walker's analysis, he points out that the grand sweep of history is always built on individual suffering. Elizabeth didn't have the luxury of purely moral choices. She had to choose between bad and worse. When she signed the death warrant for her former favorites, the Earl of Essex, her hand trembled, but she did it because mercy to one traitor means death for thousands. She remembered her own mother's execution and the deep instability of contested successions. To summarize my position in light of our discussion, Elizabeth's pragmatic, state-first approach was the only viable path to steer a fractured nation through existential threats. By separating civic duty from religious purity, she successfully prevented the total devastation of religious war and forged a stable, independent nation that survived the monumental shift from medieval Christendom to the modern era.
And to summarize my stance, the true cost of this pragmatism was a pervasive, inescapable surveillance state. It demanded an impossible moral compromise from its citizens, forcing them into psychological cages where their deepest beliefs were criminalized. While it may have secured the borders and the throne, it left a legacy built on quiet terror, hidden blood, and the crushing of the individual conscience. The state survived, but it required its people to live a lie.
Yet, where we both find common ground is on Robert Walker's central achievement in The Heretic in a Crown. The text refuses to provide clear-cut villains. It illustrates the profound tragedy of two leaders, Queen Elizabeth and Pope Pius V, both operating with absolute conviction within completely incompatible moral frameworks.
Exactly. Both believed they were saving their people. Pius believed he was saving souls for eternity, and Elizabeth believed she was saving bodies for the present. And it left the ordinary citizens, the pawns on the board, to bear the crushing weight of their clash. It highlights the immense value of examining history not through a simplistic lens of heroes and villains, but through the complex, often devastating moral compromises required of leadership.
There is so much more to explore in the rich human details of the source material. We highly recommend diving into it for yourselves to fully grasp the weight of these historical choices. Thank you for joining us for this rigorous exchange of ideas.